Frances Ford had been thrown off 3 ranches in 2 years, and every man in Crockett County, Texas, would have told you that was entirely her own fault. The year was 1883, and the land around the town of Ozona was the kind of land that broke people before it made them. Red-brown mesa country, cedar and mesquite country, where the sky went on so long and wide above you that some folks felt small standing under it, and others felt like they had finally found a ceiling high enough to breathe beneath. Frances Ford was the second kind of person. She had been that kind of person since she was old enough to sit in a saddle and argue about the direction she wanted to go, which was usually a direction that made her father push his hat back and sigh at the horizon. She was 26 years old in the spring of 1883, which the women at the Baptist church in Ozona considered a troubling age for a woman to still be unattached, and which Frances considered nobody's particular business. She had dark auburn hair that she kept braided down her back under a battered brown hat, green eyes that caught light the way creek water does, and hands that were calloused in all the right places from real work, not decorative work. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches tall, which was tall enough that she looked most men level in the eye, and she had a habit of holding that eye contact just a beat longer than was comfortable for the other party. The trouble at Haverford Ranch had started because old Calvin Haverford told her she was brushing his horses wrong. Frances knew she was not brushing his horses wrong. She had been brushing horses since she was 4 years old, and she explained this calmly and then explained it less calmly when Calvin kept talking. And then she explained it with enough volume and conviction that Calvin's wife had come to the barn door to see what the commotion was about. Calvin let her go the next morning with a week's pay and a recommendation that she find herself a husband before she found herself starving. The trouble at the Pemberton spread had been more philosophical in nature. Old Rutherford Pemberton had a specific theory about how his cattle should be moved across the eastern pasture, and his theory was wrong, and Frances had demonstrated this with such thorough and irrefutable evidence that Rutherford had let her go because he said she made him feel like a fool in front of his own hands. She took that as something of a compliment. The trouble at the Aldridge Ranch was the worst, because it was not about skill or method, but about a man named Garrett Aldridge Jr., who was 29, handsome in a clean-pressed way that Frances had always distrusted, and who had decided that a woman working on his family's land owed him a certain amount of personal warmth. Frances had told him she didn't owe him a damn thing except the work she was paid to do. He had told his father that Frances was difficult and disrespectful. She had been given a day to clear her belongings and leave. By the time she rode back into Ozona on the second Tuesday of April, her saddle pack was everything she owned. Her horse was a gray mare named Clover that had been a gift from her late father, and her financial situation was the kind that makes a person's jaw tighten when they try to do the arithmetic. She had $12 and some odd cents, which would keep her and Clover fed and stabled for perhaps 3 weeks, and after that the mathematics became unpleasant. She tied Clover outside the general store and went in to buy oats and a bar of soap, and she endured the look that Myrtle Gaines behind the counter gave her, that particular look that combined pity and vindication, the look of a woman who had always said this would happen. "I heard you left the Aldridge place," Myrtle said. "I did," Frances said. "That's 3 ranches now," Myrtle said. "I'm aware of the number," Frances said. "There aren't many left in the county that would take you on," Myrtle said, and she said it not unkindly, which was almost worse than cruelty. "Everyone knows you're, well, particular about how things are done." Frances placed her coins on the counter with more care than the action required. "I'm particular about doing things correctly," she said. "I consider that a professional virtue." Myrtle counted out her change and then paused. "You know, Mrs. Aldridge told me that you argued with every single hand on that ranch at least twice." "I argued with the ones who were wrong," Frances said pleasantly, and took her parcel and left before Myrtle could say anything else. She sat outside on the bench in front of the store and watched Ozona go about its business in the warm April morning. A wagon rolled past loaded with lumber. Two men from somewhere north of town stood arguing outside the saloon in a friendly way. A dog slept in the middle of the street with the complete confidence of an animal that has never been moved when it didn't want to be. Frances looked at that dog for a long moment and felt an unexpected kinship with it. She was still sitting there, turning her situation over in her mind like a stone she was looking for water under, when she heard her name said not by someone speaking to her, but by someone speaking about her. And the way people's voices carry when they do not quite mean to be overheard, she caught every word. It was Dallin McCreary, who ran a modest cattle operation on the south side of the county, standing in the street not 20 feet away and talking to a man Frances didn't know, a tall, lean man with a dark hat and a horse that looked like it was built for serious terrain. "That's Frances Ford right there on the bench," Dallin was saying, in the confidential tone of a man delivering important gossip. "Whole county knows her. I'd be careful if you're thinking of hiring. She's not bad at the actual work if I'm being fair, which I'll try to be. She just can't take instruction. 3 ranches in 2 years. 3 good ranches." The tall man in the dark hat turned his head and looked at Frances, and Frances looked directly back at him with the expression of a woman who has just heard every single word and intends for him to know it. Dallin McCreary saw where his companion was looking, turned red from his collar to his hat brim, and said something under his breath that Frances could not hear. The tall man in the dark hat said something back. Then Dallin walked away quickly in the direction of the hardware store, and the tall man turned fully toward Frances and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Frances said. "I'm sorry you heard that," he said. "Are you?" Frances said. He considered this with what seemed like genuine thought, which surprised her. "No," he said. "Actually, I think it's useful information. I'm Stephen Carson. I run the Carson Ranch up in the northwest corner of the county. I'm looking for an experienced hand who knows horses and cattle, specifically someone who's good with horses, because I have a new string of horses that need serious work and my current man is better with cattle." He paused. "You interested?" Frances studied him for a moment. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark eyes and a straight, direct way of looking at a person that she found more respectable than most men's way of looking at a woman. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with the kind of lean build that came from work rather than youth, and a jaw that had some serious opinion in it. He did not look like a man who was in the habit of being made to feel like a fool, but he also did not look like the kind who would object to being shown he was wrong, and those were different things. "I've been let go from 3 ranches," she said, giving him the same information Dallin had provided, because she believed in people having full knowledge. "I heard," he said. "What the county says about me is that I'm too stubborn for any ranch," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "What the county says about my ranch," he said, "is that it's always been too tame." He let that sit for a moment. "So maybe we suit each other." Frances looked at him for a long beat. Then she stood up from the bench and picked up her parcel. "What's the pay?" "$30 a month," he said, "meals and board included. Your own room in the bunkhouse, separate from the men, or I have a small cabin on the east side of the property that's been empty for 2 seasons. Your choice." "The cabin," Frances said immediately. "Fair enough," Stephen Carson said and extended his hand, and Frances Ford shook it, and that was how it began. The ride out to Carson Ranch took about 3 hours from Ozona, heading northwest through country that got wilder and more beautiful the further you went from town. The cedar thickets gave way to more open range, the kind where the grass went gold and silver in the late morning light, and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves. They rode mostly in silence, which Frances appreciated, because she had a strong feeling about men who couldn't stand silence and felt the need to fill it with chatter. Stephen Carson rode quietly, occasionally pointing out a landmark or a property line, practical information delivered without decoration. "How many horses in the new string?" Frances asked when they were about an hour out. "7, he said. Bought them from a man over in Sutton County who was selling off his operation. Good animals, all of them, but they've been handled inconsistently. Some of them have bad manners developed from bad handling, not from bad nature. That's usually how it goes, Francis said. My horse man, Pete Alderman, is 63 and honest enough to tell me his back won't let him do what the job needs, Stephen said. He'll stay on for the cattle work, which he does fine, but the horses need someone who will put real time into them. I can do that, Francis said. I know, Stephen said. I asked Dolan about you before he saw you sitting there. Francis looked at him. And what did he say? He said the same things he said when you were listening, Stephen said. But I noticed he said she's not bad at the actual work first, like that was the most important part. It is the most important part, Francis said. Yes, Stephen said simply. They came over a long rise and the Carson ranch spread itself out below them in the afternoon light, and Francis pulled Clover to a stop without quite meaning to. It was not the biggest spread she had ever seen, but it was one of the most well-kept. The main house was a solid 2-story limestone construction, which was not unusual in this part of Texas, where the rock came cheap and close to the surface. The barns were in good repair. The fences she could see from here were properly strung, and the cattle visible in the distance were healthy-looking animals. There was a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that was clearly being tended, and there were several large old live oak trees around the main house that gave it a permanent, rooted feeling, like the place had always been there and always would be. It looks like someone takes care of it, Francis said. I try, Stephen said. The county says it's too tame, she said, remembering. The county means I haven't had enough fights or disasters to generate interesting conversation, he said, and there was a dry amusement in his voice that Francis found she liked. I've been running this place since I was 24 when my father passed and left it to me. I haven't lost a season yet. The county finds that dull. How old are you now? She asked, because she was practical. 32, he said. The cabin, she said. You said it's been empty 2 seasons. Why? The hand who lived there left to go north. He had family in Kansas. He paused. It's small but solid, needs airing out. I had Rosa, who cooks for us, put clean linens in last week when I knew I was going to Ozona looking for someone. They rode down the long slope toward the ranch, and Francis felt something that she was careful not to name too quickly, something she had not felt standing in front of any of the 3 ranches she had worked before. It felt, in some quiet way, that she mistrusted because she mistrusted her own sentimental impulses, like arriving somewhere. The cabin was small and stone and perfect for one person, set back from the main buildings under the lee of a rocky rise that would shelter it from north wind in winter. Inside it was 2 rooms, a main room with a small table and 2 chairs and a cast iron stove, and a sleeping room with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. The windows were small but faced south and east, and the afternoon light came through them, yellow and warm. Francis set her pack down on the table and stood in the middle of the room and breathed in the smell of dust and stone and dry cedar. She went to work the next morning. The 7 horses Stephen had bought were in a corral beside the main barn, and when Francis first laid eyes on them, she understood immediately what he meant by inconsistent handling. They were a mixed string, 3 mares and 4 geldings, ranging in age from 4 to about 9. 2 of them were visibly nervous, high-headed and eye-rolling at ordinary movement. One gelding, a big bay, had the particular withdrawn quietness of a horse that had learned that resistance was punished, and obedience was the only safe option, which was a kind of broken that was harder to fix than wildness. The other 4 ranged from watchful to fairly calm. She spent the entire first morning just standing in the corral with them, not asking anything of them, just being present. One of the hands, a compact man named Louis Vega who had been with Stephen for several years, watched her from the fence for a while and then came and introduced himself. They're not easy, he said. They're not supposed to be easy, Francis said. Easy horses don't need much help. The bay one, we call him Judge, Louis said. He's the one that worries me. I see why, Francis said. He's not mean, he's just lost trust. Lewis nodded. The boss said you were good with horses. Did he? Francis said, surprised. He said he thought you were, Lewis said, with the small correction of an honest man. He said he'd seen you handle a horse in Ozona once, a year or two ago, some horse that was causing trouble outside the feed store. He said the way you handled it told him what he needed to know. Frances turned this over in her mind. She had a memory of exactly that incident. A young horse tied badly outside a store, panicking, and she had gone over and settled it because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone was watching. The idea that Stephen Carson had been watching and had filed it away, as information felt significant in a way she could not entirely articulate. The days established their rhythm. Frances worked with the horses every morning, and in the afternoons she helped with whatever the ranch required, which was always something, because a working cattle ranch in West Texas in 1883 had no shortage of tasks. There was fence to check and mend. There was water to manage. There was always cattle to move and account for and tend. She learned the personalities of the hands, of whom there were 7 full-time plus Pete Alderman, who stayed in a small room off the main barn and moved slowly but knew cattle the way some people know scripture. Pete Alderman watched her work with the horses for 3 days before he said anything to her, and then what he said was, "You've got a gift." "I've got patience," Frances said. "Same thing, usually," Pete said. The hands were careful with her at first, which she understood, because a woman working as a hand rather than a cook or a housekeeper was not unheard of but was not common, and men in unfamiliar situations defaulted to either awkward courtesy or deliberate rudeness until they found their footing. She was clear with all of them from the beginning, not aggressive but not apologetic either, and within the first week, the careful awkwardness settled into the easier awkwardness of people who are simply getting to know one another. Luis Vega was the most straightforward of them, a man of about 30 who had been born in the county and knew the land the way you know the face of someone you have loved a long time. Tom Briggs was 22 and new to ranch work, and trying very hard not to show how much he had yet to learn, which Frances respected. There was a man they called Big Clyde who barely spoke, but was genuinely useful in any situation requiring physical strength, and 3 more hands whose names she learned in order. Stephen Carson she saw every day but did not see often, because the running of a ranch of that size kept a man moving from before light to after dark, and the nature of the work meant that their paths crossed briefly, at mealtimes in the main cookhouse, or when a situation arose that required consultation. He was not the kind of employer who watched over her shoulder, which she appreciated with a force that told her how much she had missed it. The first time they had a real conversation, meaning a conversation that lasted more than a few exchanges, was at the end of her 2nd week, when she found him at the fence of the horse corral in the early evening, watching the horses settle for the night. She almost turned back, not wanting to intrude, but he heard her step and said without turning around, "Judge took a carrot from your hand today." "He did," she said, coming to stand beside him at the fence. "Pete said that horse has refused food from a human hand since we got him," Stephen said. "He was ready," Frances said. "You can't push the ready, it comes when it comes." Stephen was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the western sky, burning it orange and deep rose above the mesa. "Where did you learn horses?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He was the best horseman I've ever seen. He had a way with them that was almost like a conversation. I watched him until I understood what he was doing, and then I practiced until it came naturally." "Is he still around?" "He passed 3 years ago," she said. "His heart," the doctor said. "He worked too hard his whole life, and his heart just ran out of willingness." "I'm sorry," Stephen said, and the simplicity of it was better than elaboration would have been. "He was a good man," Frances said. "He was the one who taught me that doing something right matters, not doing it easy." "My father said something similar," Stephen said. "He said the ranch didn't care about your intentions, it cared about your results." He paused. "He wasn't an easy man, but he was a fair one." Those often go together, Francis said. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the horses. The big bay judge stood a little apart from the others in the way he always did, but there was something in his posture that seemed fractionally less contracted than it had been when Francis arrived. "Can I ask you something?" Stephen said. "You can ask," Francis said. "Why did you leave the Aldridge Ranch?" He said, "I heard it was about Garrett Jr." Francis felt the familiar tightening that came with that story, the anger and the weariness mixed together. He believed that a woman working on his family's land had certain obligations to him that went beyond the work, she said. "I disagreed." Stephen's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but she caught it. "You should have gone to his father." "I did," Francis said. "His father believed his son." Stephen said something under his breath that she didn't quite catch, and then was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "that won't happen here." "I know," Francis said. She said it not to reassure him, but because she meant it, and that meaning surprised her a little, because she had not known until she said it that she was certain. He looked at her then, a direct look, not the casual look of an employer checking in, something with more attention in it, and then he looked back at the horses. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Good night," Francis said, and walked back to her cabin in the last of the light, and sat at her small table for a while before she lit the lamp, thinking about the way he had looked at her, and about the way she had said, "I know," and meant it. The judge horse made his first real breakthrough at the end of the 3rd week. Francis had been patient beyond what she suspected most people would have been, letting him set the pace, not forcing anything, rewarding the smallest willingness. On a Wednesday morning, warm and clear with a good west wind moving through the ranch, she took him out of the corral alone into a small paddock and just moved around him in long, easy circles, and after about 20 minutes he put his head down and blew out a long breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deep in a horse's chest, and turned to face her and walked toward her. She stood still. He came all the way to her and put his nose against her chest and stood there breathing while she lifted one hand very slowly and rested it on his neck. She heard the fence creak and looked up, and Stephen Carson was standing at it, one boot on the lower rail, watching. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. After a moment she looked back at the horse, and Stephen stayed at the fence for a few minutes more and then walked away quietly, which was the right thing to do. That evening at supper in the cookhouse, Pete Alderman raised his tin cup. "Francis Ford and the judge horse," he said, and all the hands raised their cups, and Tom Briggs said something about it being the most interesting thing he'd seen in a year, and Lewis laughed, and Francis felt something warm and solid move through her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as belonging. She looked across the table and found Stephen looking at her with an expression that was quieter and more complex than the general celebration around the table, something that she felt rather than read, and she looked away quickly and concentrated on her food. The trouble came in May, as trouble in Crockett County tended to do, with the heat. A man named Horace Crenshaw had a spread that bordered the Carson Ranch on the northwest. And Horace Crenshaw was the kind of man who had spent his whole life being told he was right by people who wanted something from him. And the result was a man who had no capacity for the idea that he could be wrong. He had been quarreling with Stephen Carson over a water source for 2 years, a spring-fed seep that sat on ambiguous ground between their properties. And in the dry heat of early May, he decided to resolve the ambiguity by simply building a fence around the seep on his side. Francis found out about it on a Monday morning when she heard raised voices near the main house, and went to investigate and found Stephen standing in the yard talking to Lewis, who had come in fast from the northwest range. The fence was built, Lewis said, overnight. 6 of their cattle had already moved away from it, confused, and 3 of them had been drinking from that seep for years. Stephen's expression did not change in the explosive way she might have expected. He was still and cold the way deep water is cold, and that felt more serious to her than heat would have. "I'll go talk to him," Stephen said. "He's not a man you can talk to," Lewis said. "I know," Stephen said. "But I have to do it before I do anything else." Francis said, "What is the actual property line on that seep?" Both men looked at her. "The survey is ambiguous," Stephen said. "There's a question about the original land grant that neither of us has been able to resolve cleanly." "Did you file anything with the county land office?" Francis said. Stephen's expression shifted slightly, and she saw the answer before he said it. "If you file a claim of dispute with the county land office in Ozona," Francis said, "it creates a legal record that prevents either party from permanently improving or enclosing the disputed area until the dispute is resolved. I know this because my father was in a similar situation with a neighbor years ago, and the man at the land office explained the process." Stephen looked at her for a moment. "Are you certain about that?" "Certain enough that you should confirm it before you go confront Horace Crenshaw," she said. "Because if you go over there today and there's trouble, and then the law gets involved, you want to already have that filing on record." The quiet was long enough that she thought she might have overstepped, and then Stephen said, "Louis, saddle up. We're going to Ozona first." He looked back at Francis. "You should come," he said, "since you understand the process." It was not how she had anticipated spending her Monday, but she was ready in 10 minutes. They rode into Ozona 3 abreast, and the man at the county land office, whose name was Mr. Harold Pryor, and who took his bureaucratic role with great seriousness, listened to the situation, confirmed that Francis had the process exactly right, and had Stephen sign a dispute filing before noon. It created a legal record. Horace Crenshaw's fence, built within an area of disputed claim, was now a legal problem for Horace Crenshaw to explain. On the ride back, with the afternoon sun behind them, Stephen rode beside Francis and said, "Where did you learn about land filings?" "My father's situation, like I said," she said, "and I like to read. The county library is small but thorough on land law." "You like to read land law," he said. "I like to read everything," she said. "Land law is just what happened to be useful." He was quiet for a mile. Then he said, "3 ranches asked you to leave because you were too particular." "Yes," she said. "But you were right about the horses, and right about the cattle handling you argued about at Haverford, and right about the land filing today," he said. "I was right about everything I argued about," she said, and said it without vanity, just as a matter of record. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I believe you," he said, and the way he said it made something in her chest contract pleasantly. Horace Crenshaw came to the Carson ranch 4 days later, riding in hot and furious, and Stephen met him in the yard with the kind of absolute calm that Francis had come to recognize as his particular brand of stubbornness, which was very different from her own brand, but was stubbornness nonetheless. Crenshaw ranted for a good while about the filing and the legal interference and the nerve of it. Stephen listened without interruption, and then said precisely that the matter would be resolved by the county land office according to the law, and that in the meantime the fence would need to come down from any portion of land still under dispute, and that if it did not, the matter would go to a judge. Crenshaw left without the fence coming down that day, but 3 weeks later it did come down, when the county surveyor came out and established a line that gave the seep clearly to the Carson side of the boundary. Horace Crenshaw had to remove his fence and did it with the expression of a man who will not forget the injury, but the matter was settled in law, and there was nothing further for his expression to accomplish. On the evening after the surveyor left, Stephen found Francis with the horses and said simply, "You were right." "I usually am," she said, and softened it with the small private smile that she was beginning to allow herself around him. He leaned against the fence and looked at her and said, "That doesn't bother me." "I know," she said. "It's one of the things I noticed about you." "What are the other things?" he said, and his voice had something in it that was different from their usual practical exchanges, something that moved toward something rather than resting still. Francis looked at him, this lean and serious man who had hired her when the whole county said nobody should, who had taken her word on the land filing without demanding she prove it first, who stood at the fence watching her with the horse, and understood that what he was watching was something worth seeing. She felt the particular precariousness of the moment, the way things sometimes balance on the edge of becoming different. "That you listen," she said. "When someone says something worth hearing, you actually listen to it. Most people perform listening, you actually do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "My father didn't listen well," he said. "I learned from watching the cost of that. And that you don't talk about yourself like you're the most interesting thing in any given room," she added. "I'm usually not," he said. "Tonight you might be," she said, and then felt heat in her face and looked back at the horses, because she had not entirely meant to say that, or perhaps she had, but she had not meant to say it yet. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a tone that was careful and real, "Francis." "Stephen," she said, still looking at the horses, because if she looked at him right now she was not sure what expression her face might choose. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it straight without any indirection, because I think you'd find indirection irritating and I would rather be honest." "I would," she said, "find it irritating, so be direct." "I've been thinking about you," he said, "since approximately the third day you were here. Not in a way that's about the work, though the work is excellent. In a way that's about you personally. I want to know if there is any possibility that you feel anything similar." Francis finally looked at him. He was looking at her with the same directness he always had, but there was something underneath it that she had not quite seen before, something that was careful and hopeful at the same time, something that wanted her and was ready to be told no and was asking honestly anyway. "Yes," she said. "There is that possibility." He breathed out. It was a small sound, but it told her something. "Good," he said. "That's good." "It doesn't change the work," she said. "I want that understood." "It doesn't change the work," he agreed immediately. "And I won't be managed," she said. "I've noticed you're a man who has opinions about how things should be done. So do I. That's going to cause arguments." "I expect it will," he said. And there was something in his voice that sounded like he was actually looking forward to it, which was the most surprising and the most correct thing he could possibly have said. She walked back to her cabin that night with the warm Texas night pressing close around her, full of cricket song and the smell of cedar and distant cattle, and she sat on the step of her cabin for a long while in the dark, not thinking in words exactly, just feeling the shape of the thing that was happening, letting it be as large as it wanted to be. The following Sunday was the first time he came to her, not to discuss work, but to ask if she would ride out with him to see the northwest part of the property, which he said he wanted to show her. Francis said yes, and spent approximately 7 minutes thinking about what that meant before she made herself stop and just go. They rode out in the early morning before the heat built, through country that got wilder and more beautiful the further from the ranch buildings they went. He took her to a place he called the Upper Rim, a long natural limestone ledge that looked north and west over miles of the most extraordinary country Francis had ever seen. The land below was pale gold and green, striated with shadow and light, and in the middle distance a line of cottonwoods marked a creek she hadn't known was there, bright green against the pale land like something promised. "My father showed me this place when I was 8, Stephen said. "I come here when I need to think." "What do you think about when you come here?" Francis asked. "Usually the ranch," he said. "Problems to solve, things to decide." "My father used to say that hard decisions look different from high ground." "He was right," Francis said, looking out at the long view. "I thought about you here," Stephen said, "after I hired you. I came up here and thought about whether I'd made the right call. And," she said, "I decided I had," he said. "Not because of the horses or the land filing or any of the practical things, though those are all real. Because of the way you shook my hand in front of that general store and looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your time." Francis smiled at the horizon. "I was," she said. "I know," he said. "And I thought I want to keep being worth that person's time." She looked at him then, and he was already looking at her, and the distance between them was not very much, and the air between them had the particular quality of air before something important happens. He said, "May I?" and she said, "Yes." before he could finish it, and he leaned forward and kissed her very gently, and she kissed him back not gently at all because she was not a gentle type of person, and there was a moment when both of them were smiling too much for it to be a proper kiss, and it became the kind of kiss that two people share when they are both honest about what they want. When they separated, the vista was still out there, the miles of wild limestone country and the line of cottonwoods and the pale gold grass, and Stephen's hand was in hers, and Frances thought, "I have never been more in the right place than I am right now." "I should tell you," Stephen said, "that I am not a man who does things halfway. If this is something we're doing, I'm doing it fully." "So am I," Frances said. "Always have been. It's half of why I've been difficult." "You're not difficult," he said with a firmness that startled her. "Everyone says I am," she said. "Everyone says you're stubborn about doing things right," he said. "That's not difficult, that's honest. The men who called you difficult were the ones who wanted you to pretend they weren't wrong." He paused. "I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again. I'd rather you tell me when it happens." "I will," she said. "You can count on that." "I know," he said, and smiled. And it was one of the rare full smiles she had seen from him, the kind that changed his whole face, and she thought that she could spend a great deal of time working to earn that smile and consider it well spent. The summer of 1883 moved around them in long hot days and cooler nights, and the thing between them grew the way things grow when two people do not try to manage them, naturally and in its own direction. They rode out together in the evenings when the work allowed, and ate supper together more often than not, and talked in the way that people talk when they find that talking to someone is better than not talking to them, going from the practical to the personal and back again without ceremony. He told her about his childhood on the ranch, his father's difficult silences, and the way the land had been both the problem and the solution of his growing up. She told him about her mother, who had died when Frances was 12, and about the years after that when it had been just her and her father on a small claim outside of Sonora, two people who were equally stubborn and equally devoted to each other and to the work. "He wanted me to marry," Frances said one evening, sitting on the step of her cabin in the last light. Stephen was sitting on the ground below the step, which put their heads at about the same level, and this arrangement had become natural to them in the way that comfortable arrangements become natural. Not badly, not pressingly, but he wanted it for me. He used to say he worried about what would happen to me after he was gone, who would be in my corner. "And then he went," Stephen said. "And then he went," she said. "And for 3 years I've been in my own corner, which I'm capable of, but it's," she paused, looking for honest words, "it's tiring. Being entirely self-reliant is possible, but it's like carrying your own water everywhere you go when there are rivers." He looked up at her. "I'd like to be a river for you if that's possible," he said, and it was such a simple and earnest thing to say that her throat tightened. "You're already useful in that direction," she said, which was not the whole of what she meant but was what she could manage without the words becoming more than she wanted to give yet. He put his hand on her knee, just resting it there, and she put her hand over his, and they sat like that while the light went out of the sky, and the stars came out enormous and closed the way they only do in country that far from other lights. The hands knew, of course. People who live and work in close quarters always know, and the Carson Ranch hands were observant people, because observation was part of their survival. Luis Vega said nothing for a long while, and then one morning when Frances was working with the horses and he came to the fence, he said without preamble, "The boss is better since you got here." "Better how?" Frances said. "Lighter," Luis said. "He always worked hard and ran the place right, but he was carrying something heavy. He's lighter." Frances kept her eyes on the horse she was working. "I haven't done anything." "Sure," Luis said, and went back to his work and said no more about it. Tom Briggs, who was 22 and romantic in the unreflective way of young men, was rather more direct about the whole thing and asked Frances at supper one night if she was going to marry the boss, which caused Pete Alderman to cough loudly and look at the ceiling, and Frances to say calmly that she didn't think that was any of Tom's business, and Stephen, who was sitting across the table, to say equally calmly, "I hope so." which made Tom go red and Pete stop coughing, and everyone else at the table find something very interesting to look at on their tin plates. Frances looked at Stephen. He was looking at her with that direct, steady look that she had come to know very well, and underneath it was the same careful hopefulness she had first seen that evening at the horse corral. "That's a discussion," she said, "for another time." "Of course," he said, and went back to his supper, and she went back to hers, but the word hope was in the room with them all evening. He asked her properly 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, standing in her cabin doorway with his hat in his hands and the morning sun behind him, looking more uncomfortable than she had ever seen him, which told her how much it mattered to him. He said he knew she was a woman who did not do things for convention's sake, and he knew she valued her independence more than most things, and he said he was not asking her to become less of herself, which he had a feeling was not possible in any case. He said he was asking because he could not picture the rest of his life without her in it, and he had found that over the summer every time he solved a problem his first instinct was to tell her about it, and every time he saw something beautiful his first instinct was to show her, and he thought that meant something permanent. Frances stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked at this man she had come to know and trust and love in the way she loved things that were real and solid and honest, and she said, "Yes, with the understanding that I am not going to be manageable." "I'd be disappointed if you were," he said. "And I will keep working," she said. "I need to work. This ranch will not survive without you working," he said sincerely. "The horses alone, all right," she said, and the laugh that came out of her was genuine and full, the kind she didn't give often, and he looked like a man who had been given something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to hold carefully enough. They were married in October of 1883 in the town of Ozona, in the small Baptist church on the main street, on a cool blue-sky day that was as perfect as West Texas ever got. The ceremony was simple because both of them preferred simple things. Pete Alderman, who turned out to have a remarkable singing voice, sang a hymn. Louis Vega was a witness. Tom Briggs cried and denied it to anyone who looked at him. Myrtle Gaines from the general store was there, and had the good grace to tell Frances she looked beautiful and to mean it, and Frances thanked her and actually meant that too. The ride back to the ranch that afternoon was the two of them alone, and Stephen rode close to her the whole way, and when she looked at him, she saw that he was doing the same thing she was doing, looking at the familiar country around them with the particular eyes of people who have just made something permanent, seeing how the same land can look different when you know it will be your land for the rest of your life. That evening, the Hands had put up a table in the yard, and Rosa had cooked enough food for twice the number of people present, and there were lanterns strung in the live oak trees, and someone had a fiddle, and even Pete Alderman danced, which Frances would not have predicted but which delighted her. She danced with Louis and with Tom and with Pete, and then she danced with her husband, who was not a natural dancer but was a determined one, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. She said quietly near his ear, "The whole county said I was too stubborn for any ranch." He said, equally quietly, "And I said my ranch had always been too tame." "Look at us," she said. "Look at us," he agreed, and held her closer, and the fiddle played on. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was a partnership in the most complete sense of the word. Frances moved her few possessions from the cabin to the main house, though she kept the cabin for work purposes, using it to keep records and to read on the evenings when she wanted solitude, which Stephen understood and respected because he understood that a person who had been entirely self-sufficient for years needed to keep some spaces of their own. They argued, as she had predicted, because they were both people with strong convictions about correct methods. They argued about cattle rotation and water management, and the right time to sell off part of the string, and whether the new hand Stephen wanted to hire had the right qualities. They argued with the particular energy of two people who respect each other enough to disagree without cruelty. And in most of the arguments, one of them would eventually say the decisive right thing, and the other would listen and adjust. And the ratio of who did the adjusting was close enough to equal that neither of them kept score. The first time Frances was genuinely wrong, the experience had an interesting texture to it. It was about the management of the winter hay, and her plan had a flaw that Stephen identified, a flaw that was real and significant, and he explained it clearly and without gloating, which was the important part. Frances listened, recognized that he was right, said so directly, and revised the plan. She expected to feel diminished by it, because being wrong had always seemed to her like a loss, and instead she felt something that surprised her. She felt the particular quality of trust that comes from being corrected by someone who is on your side. "You could have made me feel smaller about that," she said that evening. "Why would I want to do that?" he said, genuinely puzzled. "Most people do," she said. He considered this. "Most people confuse winning with being right," he said. "I'd rather we both be right." She looked at him across the supper table in the warm lamplight of the kitchen and thought that she had to stop being surprised by him, because every time he said a thing like that it knocked her slightly off balance, and she needed her balance for running a ranch. She did not actually stop being surprised by him. It became one of the things she loved about him, that he continued, after months and then years, to produce small moments of unexpected rightness, like a man who keeps finding coins in old coat pockets. By the spring of 1884, Frances had finished the work with the 7 horses, and the results were, she thought, some of the best work she had ever done. Judge, the big bay who had been the most broken, was now a horse that any competent rider could take out and trust completely. He had not forgotten his difficult history. You could still see it in the extra second he sometimes took when a new person approached, but he had enough restored trust to work through his fear rather than collapse into it. Frances thought there was a lesson in that for all creatures. She had also, without quite planning to, begun to train Tom Briggs in horse work alongside the cattle work, because she had seen that he had a natural patience with animals, and it seemed a waste not to develop it. Tom absorbed the teaching with the enthusiasm of a young man who has found something he is genuinely good at, and Frances felt an unexpected satisfaction in the passing on of it, the knowledge that the way her father had taught her would go forward through another set of hands. One morning, in late April, she was sitting in the cabin going over the accounts, which had become partly her responsibility, because she had a sharper eye for numbers than she had ever formerly been credited for, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse, and then Stephen's voice in the yard calling her name with a quality she recognized as something having happened. She came out to find him dismounting fast, his expression carrying the particular tightness of a man dealing with something that needs managing. A family called the Harpers, whose claim was about 2 miles south of the Carson boundary, were in trouble. Their youngest son, who was 9, had fallen in the creek and been pulled out by his older sister but was sick with fever now, and the father had ridden to the nearest ranch, which was theirs, because it was a long, hard ride to Ozona from their claim. Their oldest daughter, who was 17, had come with the news because her father was staying with the boy. They needed someone who could ride hard to Ozona for the doctor. "I'll go," Frances said. "I'll go," Stephen said, at exactly the same moment. They looked at each other. "I'm faster," Frances said. "Clover is not faster than Midnight," Stephen said, referring to his black horse. "I know the road better in the middle section," Frances said. "In the dark, yes," he said. "It's light." She looked at him for approximately 2 seconds. "Go," she said. "Go fast." He went. She organized the ranch to receive the Harper family and sent Lewis to the Harper claim with a wagon to bring the boy back to the Carson ranch, where there was a proper bed and Rosa to help with the nursing until the doctor arrived. The decision was practical, not sentimental, though it was also true that Frances would not have left a sick child in a one-room cabin 2 miles from help if she could prevent it. The doctor arrived from Ozona by late afternoon, Stephen having made the ride in under 2 hours, and the Harper boy, whose name was Daniel and who had the hollow eyes and burning skin of a serious fever, was in the guest room under Rosa's fierce management. The doctor stayed the night. The fever broke the following morning, and by afternoon Daniel Harper was sitting up in bed asking for food, which the doctor said was an excellent sign. Daniel's father, Eli Harper, was a quiet man who had been trying to hold his claim together alone since his wife had passed 2 winters before, and the combination of gratitude and exhaustion and relief made him almost unable to speak when the doctor told him his son would recover. Frances made him sit down and eat something and drink coffee, and she did not speak more than was necessary, which was the right thing to do for a man who was running on the edge of himself. Stephen sat beside Eli Harper and talked to him quietly for a long while that afternoon, and Frances, coming through the main room, heard enough to know that they were discussing the claim, and the difficulties of running it alone and practical possible solutions. And she thought about what she had heard about Stephen Carson from the county, that his ranch was too tame, too quiet, not enough drama. And she thought that what the county actually meant was that he was a man who spent his energy building things instead of breaking them. The Harpers left the following morning, Daniel pale, but sitting upright in the wagon with considerable dignity for a 9-year-old. Eli Harper shook Stephen's hand for a long time and then turned to Frances and did the same, and he said, "Mrs. Carson, your husband is a good man." "He is," Frances said. "And from what Lewis tells me," Eli said, "you're the one who ran the practical side of this." "We worked together," Frances said firmly. Eli Harper nodded. "My wife was that kind of woman," he said. "The ranch fell apart when she passed." The simplicity of that assessment stayed with Frances for days. In the summer of 1884, she discovered she was expecting their first child, and she sat with this information for approximately 24 hours before she told Stephen, not because she was uncertain about it, but because she wanted to be sure she had thought through everything she wanted to say about how it would affect the work. She told him in the evening on the steps of the main house, straightforwardly. His reaction was not the loud or theatrical variety. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something important was happening inside him, and then he looked at her with an expression she did not have a word for, something that was joy and seriousness together, something that recognized the weight of what she had just said. "Are you well?" he said, because that was always his first question when something significant happened. "I'm fine," she said. "Strong as I've always been. I'll work as long as I can work safely." "I know you will," he said. And then more quietly, "Frances, thank you," she looked at him, "for telling you, for being here," he said, "for saying yes last October, for everything since." She put her hand over his on the step. "I made the right call," she said. "So did I," he said, and for a moment they were both very quiet, looking out at the ranch in the long evening light, the horses in the corral and the cattle visible on the near pasture, and the live oaks around the house with their leaves moving in the dry summer wind. Their son was born in February of 1885, at the tail end of a cold that had come sweeping down from the north and left the country white for 3 days, which was unusual enough in Crockett County to feel like an occasion. The doctor came out from Ozona and Rosa was there, and the birth was long and difficult in the way that first births often are, and Frances endured it with the same stubborn application she brought to everything, and Stephen spent most of the night in the hallway outside their bedroom, pacing a path in the wood floor. The boy came into the world just before dawn, announcing himself with conviction, and when the doctor put him in Frances's arms, she looked at this small, furious person and felt something that rearranged everything inside her, quietly and permanently, like a room being shifted. They named him Thomas Ford Carson, Thomas for Frances's father, Ford for the family name she intended to keep in use, and Carson for the ranch that was now as much hers as his. Tom Briggs, when he heard the name, turned red with emotion and declared it the finest name he had ever heard, which made everyone at breakfast laugh. Thomas Ford Carson was a determined baby who quickly established himself as a person with strong opinions about his own schedule and comfort requirements, which Frances found entirely reasonable, and which Stephen said was obviously inherited from her side. Frances pointed out that stubbornness was not genetic in any documented medical literature she had ever encountered, and Stephen said he had done his own empirical research and the evidence was compelling, and she threw a kitchen towel at him and he caught it, grinning. Life on the Carson Ranch in 1885 and 1886 had a fullness and richness to it that Frances sometimes sat still in the middle of and noticed deliberately, because she had learned from her father's death that the present abundance was worth marking. The ranch prospered. The reputation of the horses they were breeding and training spread beyond Crockett County to neighboring Sutton and Pecos counties, and they had more buyers for trained horses than they could supply, which was a good problem to have, and which Frances managed with the same direct precision she brought to all business. She also taught young Thomas to sit in a saddle before he was 2, which Stephen observed with an expression of fond resignation, because the child had been put on Clover's back by his mother at an age when most children are still uncertain about walking, and had responded by immediately trying to steer, which Frances took as a positive developmental sign. There was a period in 1886 when a drought made the summer very hard, the kind of hard that the land of West Texas could deliver without warning, when the grass turned brittle, and the cattle needed constant management to find enough grazing. Frances and Stephen and the hands worked longer days during those months, and the arguments at the end of those days sometimes had sharp edges because tired people living in close quarters under pressure will find their sharp edges. But the arguments never went to places that were intended to wound, which Frances thought was one of the marks of a genuinely good partnership, that you could fight about real things without using the fight as cover for something uglier. She was pregnant with their second child during the worst of that drought, which added a layer of physical difficulty to everything. And there were days when she sat down in the cabin that she still used for her work and was simply tired in a way she could not will herself through. And on those days, Stephen would come and find her and bring her water and sit with her without making it a thing, just being present. "You don't have to be strong about everything," he said once on a particularly hard August afternoon. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I just usually want to." "You can want to and still sit down," he said. "I am sitting down," she said. "Good," he said, and handed her the water, and sat beside her in the small stone cabin with the afternoon heat pressing at the walls, and they were quiet together in the particular companionable way they had developed. 2 people who were entirely comfortable with silence between them, because the silence was full of the same things. Their daughter arrived in November of 1886, smaller and more interested in watching the world quietly than Thomas had been, which made Frances suspect she was going to be the more dangerous of the 2 children. They named her Margaret Grace Carson, and Rosa, who had been with the Carson Ranch since before Stephen inherited it, cried when she held her, which was Rosa's first visible display of sentiment in the 3 years Frances had known her, and which told Frances something about the depth of Rosa's feeling for this place and these people. Thomas, who was not quite 2, had to be physically held back from the baby on several occasions due to his enthusiasm, which Frances privately thought was the most sensible emotional response in the household. The ranch continued to grow in reputation, and in the quiet, solid way that well-run things grow when the people running them know what they're doing. Stephen expanded the cattle operation in 1887, purchasing additional land to the south when a neighbor sold off voluntarily, and Frances negotiated part of that purchase because she was better at it than Stephen, who had a tendency to be too straightforward in a situation that called for patience, which she told him directly and he accepted, handing it over without resentment. In 1888, Tom Briggs, who had been with the ranch for 5 years and had become genuinely excellent with horses, told Stephen he wanted to stay on permanently, not just as a hand but as a full partner in the horse breeding and training operation, and Stephen brought this to Frances because it was her domain and her decision. She interviewed Tom for an hour over the kitchen table, asking him questions that made him sweat, and then told him yes, she would recommend it to Stephen, on the condition that he understood who was in charge of the horse operation, which was her, and he said yes, ma'am, with a sincerity that she found satisfying. Stephen, when she reported back, said, "How did he survive the interview?" "He was honest," she said. "He admitted what he didn't know as readily as what he did. That's the only thing I require." "Is it?" Stephen said. She considered. "And competence," she said. "Both things." "Both things," he agreed. Pete Alderman retired fully from active work in 1888, his back finally refusing to cooperate with what his will wanted, and he moved to a smaller room in the main house where Rosa fed him, and he spent his days sitting in the yard in good weather and by the fire in poor weather, and telling Thomas and Margaret stories about the early days of the Carson Ranch that Francis was not sure were entirely factual, but which were entertaining. Francis found him one morning telling Thomas, who was 3, a detailed account of a cattle drive that involved bears, which were not native to this part of Texas, and when she raised an eyebrow at Pete, he said, with complete serenity, "The boy needs bears." There are not enough bears in modern cattle stories. She let the bear story stand. In 1889, 6 years after Frances had sat on the bench outside the Ozona General Store with $12 to her name and no prospects that didn't require swallowing something important about herself, the Carson Ranch won a prize at the County Agricultural Fair for the quality of their trained horses, a distinction that was written up in the Ozona newspaper in 3 sentences that Frances cut out and kept in the small cedar box where she kept things that mattered. The article mentioned Stephen Carson by name and the Carson Ranch by reputation, and in the 3rd sentence it mentioned Frances Ford Carson, which was the name she used for all ranch business and all legal documents and always had, as the partner and horse expert whose methods have made the Carson string the most sought-after trained horses in the Pecos Valley. Frances read this sentence twice, not because she needed validation, but because she recognized in it the particular satisfaction of a record set straight. Myrtle Gaines at the general store cut out the same article and put it in her window, which Frances discovered on her next trip to Ozona, and which made her stand in front of the window for a moment with an expression that was more complicated than simple pleasure. Dallin McCreary passed her on the street that same day and said, with the air of a man who has thought about something for a long time, "I want to apologize for what I said that day outside the general store." Frances looked at him. He was sincere, she could tell. "You said she's not bad at the actual work," she said, which was the most honest thing in what you said. The rest of it was county gossip and you know it. "I do know it," Dallin said. "I should have said it better." "Yes," Frances said, "but you also led Stephen Carson to hire me by indirection, so it worked out." Dallin smiled with something like relief. "He always had good judgment," he said. "He does," Frances agreed and meant it wholly. Thomas was 4 in 1889, old enough to follow her around the horse corral and absorb her commentary on what she was doing with the focused attention that she recognized, with a warmth that went down to her bones, as her father's attention in miniature. He had Stephen's dark eyes and her auburn hair, and the combination was, she thought, excessive in its effectiveness, because when he tilted his head and looked at her with that question in his face, she could deny him almost nothing. Margaret, 2 years old, was a small, serious, observant person who had not yet determined what her primary interest was going to be, but was clearly going to be very thorough about it once she decided. She spent long periods of time studying objects and animals with a concentration that reminded Frances of no one she could identify, which suggested that Margaret was going to be entirely her own creature, which Frances considered perfectly satisfactory. Stephen, watching both children in the yard one October afternoon in 1889, said to Frances, "My father would have been undone by them." "The good kind," Frances said. "Yes," he said. "He was hard, but he was not a man without love. He just didn't know what to do with it most of the time." A lot of people are that way, Francis said. Were you, he said. She thought about this. I knew what to do with love for the work, she said. For the horses, for my father. I didn't know how to be with a person. I was always afraid, she paused, looking for the honest words, that needing someone would make me less, that it would be a weakness. And, he said, and it made me more, she said. Considerably more. I resent not knowing that sooner. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, watching their children in the warm afternoon light, and the ranch spread out around them, and the live oaks moved, and somewhere in the corral judged the bay horse, who was 10 years old now and the most serene animal on the property, lifted his head and then put it back down again, satisfied. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was a good winter, meaning cold enough to keep the grass healthy for spring but not so brutal as to threaten the cattle, and they came through it with all their animals and all their people intact, which Pete Alderman said from his chair by the fire was the definition of a good season, and no one could argue with that. Francis sat down in January of 1890 and wrote a long letter to the Crockett County Agricultural Society about the methods she and Tom Briggs had developed for training horses that had come from inconsistent or poor handling, detailing the process in practical, specific terms. She did it because Lewis had mentioned that a family on the other side of the county was struggling with a string of difficult horses and couldn't afford a trainer, and she thought that if the information was available to people who needed it, it should be. The letter was passed around among the ranching families of the county, and she received 7 responses, including one from Eli Harper, whose son Daniel was now 16 and helping his father run the claim, saying that the method had worked on a horse of theirs that they had almost given up on. She was pleased by this, and she was also pleased to find that she was pleased by it because the pleasure was purely for the thing itself, the information going where it could help, and not for any credit attached to it. You should write more, Stephen told her, reading the letter she had written. He had read it carefully and then reread certain sections. You explain things clearly. I explain things correctly, she said. Clarity is the side effect. Write more, he said again, and she looked at him and thought that she probably would. In the spring of 1890, Frances discovered she was expecting again, their 3rd child, and this time she told Stephen the same evening she knew, without the 24 hours of thinking it through, because she had learned by now that holding information from him while she processed it alone was a habit from the years of being entirely alone, and she did not need that habit anymore. He received the news the same way he always received important news from her, with that particular stillness and then the full attention, and then he said, "Are you happy about it?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Very," he said, "though I'm aware that 3 children on a working ranch is exactly what this ranch is for," Francis said. "Among other things." "Among other things," he agreed. Their 2nd son arrived in November of 1890, and they named him Robert James Carson, James for Stephen's father, because Stephen had made his peace with his father long ago and believed that difficult people still deserve to be remembered. Robert James arrived with the loud confidence of a child who has made a decision and intends to commit to it, and within his 1st month, Francis had the distinct impression that he was going to be the most interesting of the 3, in the way that interesting can be both a compliment and a warning. Thomas, now 5, received his brother with a seriousness that suggested he understood that his position in the household had changed in some fundamental structural way. Margaret, 3, was utterly enchanted by the baby and had to be watched carefully because her idea of gentle was somewhat interpretive. The ranch in 1890 was a different thing from the ranch Francis had ridden into in the spring of 1883. It was bigger, better, deeper in every way. The horse operation was genuinely notable across several counties. The cattle numbers were healthy. The land was well managed, the fences kept, the water sources reliable and protected. They had 7 full-time hands now, including Tom Briggs, who was as much a part of the place as the limestone walls. Pete Alderman had passed away peacefully in the summer of 1890, going to sleep one evening and not waking, which was a death that Francis thought suited him entirely, a man who had done his work and was ready to stop. They buried him under the larger of the live oaks by the main house and placed a stone marker that said Pete Alderman, good hand and true friend, which covered everything that mattered. Rosa had a daughter, Catalina, who was 12 and had begun helping in the kitchen and around the house, and who had the kind of competence beyond her years that Francis recognized immediately and made sure to acknowledge, because she was old enough to know how rarely competent young women were told they were doing well. In 1891, Thomas started his formal schooling, riding into Ozona 3 days a week with Louis or Tom, and in 1892 Margaret joined him, and Francis watched them go and felt the complicated emotion of a woman who has done the essential thing and now has to let the essential thing develop on its own schedule. Stephen stood beside her the first morning both children rode away toward town and said nothing, which was exactly right. "Did you know," Francis said, when the sound of the hoofbeats had died out, "that when I was sitting on that bench in Ozona with $12 and nothing ahead of me, I thought about what my father would say?" "What did you think he would say?" Stephen said. "That I should stop being too proud to ask for help," she said. "He always said that was my worst fault." "Is it?" Stephen said. "It was," she said. "I've been asking for help for 8 years, from you, from the hands, even from Tom Briggs sometimes, which I did not anticipate." "What does it feel like?" Stephen said. She considered. "Like drinking from a river instead of carrying water," she said, which circled back to something she had said to him years ago on the cabin steps, and she saw in his face that he remembered it too. The county, in the years that followed, had updated its assessment of Frances Ford Carson. It no longer said she was too stubborn for any ranch. It said she was the best horse trainer in the Pecos Valley, which was both more accurate and considerably more useful as a reputation. It said she and Stephen Carson ran the best operation in Crockett County, which was generally agreed to be true. It said, among the women at the Baptist church, that Frances Ford Carson was a woman who had done things her own way, and it had turned out well, which was said with a mixture of admiration and residual uncertainty, because the county was always more comfortable with things that confirmed its expectations than things that revised them. Frances was comfortable with being the thing that revised expectations. She had been doing it her whole life. She was good at it. In the summer of 1893, when Thomas was 8 and Margaret was 6 and Robert was almost 3, Frances stood one morning at the fence of the main horse corral, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching Tom Briggs work with a young mare that had come to them from a rancher in Pecos County, a difficult animal that had thrown 2 handlers already. She watched Tom move around the horse with the patience she had taught him, the patience her father had taught her, the patience that was its own kind of conversation, and the mare began slowly to lower her head. Stephen came and stood beside her, his own coffee in hand, and they watched together. "Tom's better than I was at his age," Frances said. "Had a better teacher," Stephen said. "He had a good teacher," Frances said. "Whether I was better than average at his age is a separate question." "The answer is yes," Stephen said. "You didn't know me at his age," she said. "I know the evidence," he said. "Retroactively, I'm confident." She smiled and looked at the horse and Tom and then at the wider country beyond the corral fence, the limestone and cedar and pale grass of West Texas in the high summer, beautiful in its particular unsparing way. "I was thinking about what we should do with the east pasture," she said. "I think it's time to put in the second water source we discussed." "I was thinking the same thing this morning," he said. "You were thinking about the east pasture at 6 in the morning," she said. "I was thinking about you, and the east pasture came up adjacently," he said, and she looked at him and he looked back at her with that expression she knew as well as any landscape on the ranch, the one that was warm and specific and entirely for her. "You've been thinking about me adjacently for 10 years," she said. "Longer," he said. I saw you settle a panicking horse outside the Ozona feed store 2 years before I hired you." "I know," she said. "Lewis told me. You'd been watching me for 2 years before you hired me." "I was waiting for the right opening," he said. "Which was Dallin McCreary talking about me when he didn't think I could hear," she said. "The county produced something useful for once," he said. She laughed, the full genuine laugh that she gave freely now, the one that had been rarer in the years before him, and he smiled at the sound of it the way he always did, like a man who has access to something he considers a privilege. They stood at the fence together in the morning light, two people who had built something real from a bench in Ozona, and a handshake, and a willingness to be stubborn about the right things. The ranch moved around them in its daily rhythm, the hands going to their tasks, the horses settling in the corral, the children's voices somewhere near the house, Rose's distant sound from the kitchen, and the enormous Texas sky above it, all wide and blue and carrying the kind of light that makes everything look like it has always been exactly this way and always will be. Frances Ford Carson had been told her whole life that she was too much, too stubborn, too particular, too convinced of her own rightness to fit anywhere for long. And she had stood in the county general store and in the church and in the conversation of people who meant well and some who didn't. And she had been the subject of assessments that were meant to diminish her into something more convenient. And she had found, in the northwest corner of Crockett County, a ranch that was too tame, and a rancher who said so, and who had looked at everything the county said about her, and decided it sounded like exactly what he needed. And it had been, and they had been, and they were. Robert James Carson, not quite 3, came running across the yard toward the corral fence with the absolute urgency of a small person who has something very important to communicate. And Stephen set down his coffee and swung his youngest son up onto his shoulders. And Thomas came at a more dignified 8-year-old walk behind his brother. And Margaret appeared at Thomas's elbow with the quiet self-possession that was entirely her own. And the morning went on, and the horses moved in the corral. And the land went on forever in every direction, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that a life could be asked to hold. Frances Ford Carson set down her coffee cup on the top fence rail and went to work.